In the spring of 1945, on an island that had never asked to become the last great battlefield of the Pacific War, hundreds of thousands of Okinawan civilians found themselves trapped between two advancing armies, caught in what would become known as the Typhoon of Steel, a battle whose sheer volume of naval, artillery, and aerial firepower exceeded almost anything else the entire war had produced. What happened to the civilian population of Okinawa during those 3 brutal months, and in the years that followed, is one of the most somber and, for decades, least publicly examined chapters of the entire Pacific War, a story involving mass civilian death on a scale that dwarfed the military casualties on both sides combined, driven in significant part by a fear campaign the civilians themselves had been taught to believe long before the first American soldier ever set foot on the island. This is the story of what happened to the Okinawan civilians who lived through the Battle of Okinawa and the difficult, ongoing reckoning with exactly how so many of them came to die. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a civilian population end up suffering losses on a scale that exceeded the military casualties of the battle being fought around them? And why did so many of the deaths come not directly from combat, but from decisions civilians themselves were led to believe were their only remaining option? Understanding why this specific fear campaign proved so effective requires understanding the broader historical relationship between Okinawa and mainland Japan in the decades leading up to the war. Okinawa had been formally incorporated into the Japanese state only in the late 19th century, following the dissolution of the independent Ryukyu Kingdom, and Okinawan cultural and linguistic traditions had, in the decades since, been subject to sustained assimilation pressure from mainland Japanese administration, a historical background that shaped how thoroughly Japanese military authorities on the island in 1945 could exert direct influence and control over the civilian population's understanding of what awaited them if the battle went against Japan. It is worth stating clearly, before examining the specific and difficult events of this battle, that this account approaches an extraordinarily sensitive chapter of Pacific War history, one involving mass civilian death, under circumstances that continue to affect living survivors, their families, and the broader Okinawan community today. The intent here is to document what historians have carefully established about these events, and to honor the survivors and victims by presenting their experience with the historical accuracy and gravity it deserves, rather than to dwell on graphic specifics that would serve no informational purpose beyond the historical record itself. Okinawa, the largest island in the Ryukyu chain, held a civilian population of several 100,000 people at the time of the American invasion in April of 1945, a population with its own distinct regional culture and history that had, for decades before the war, occupied a complicated position within the broader Japanese state, treated by mainland Japanese administration in ways that many Okinawans themselves experienced as a form of second-class status within the empire. As American forces prepared for what military planners understood would be a critical campaign, potentially the last major island battle before any eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves, Japanese military authorities on Okinawa began a systematic campaign of instruction and propaganda specifically directed at the civilian population, teaching that American forces, if they captured Okinawan civilians, would subject them to torture, rape, and murder. A narrative that stood in stark contrast to how the actual American occupation would eventually treat civilians who came into its custody. This propaganda campaign was not incidental to Japanese military planning, but reflected a broader strategic and cultural framework in which civilian death was, in various documented instances, treated as preferable to the perceived shame of capture, a doctrine that had already shaped military conduct at earlier Pacific battles, and that would, on Okinawa, extend with particular and devastating force into the civilian population itself. The scale of the American invasion force committed to Okinawa reflected the strategic significance planners attached to the island, involving one of the largest combined naval, air, and ground operations of the entire Pacific War, a force size and firepower commitment that, combined with the equally determined Japanese defensive preparations under General Mitsuru Ushijima, created exactly the kind of sustained, high-intensity combat environment that would leave civilians caught between the two forces with almost no safe location to shelter for the battle's full duration. As the battle unfolded and American forces advanced across the island through April, May, and into June of 1945, Okinawan civilians found themselves caught directly in the path of some of the heaviest sustained combat of the entire Pacific War. Artillery and naval gunfire bombardment so continuous and so intense that surviving accounts from both Japanese and American participants consistently describe conditions unlike anything encountered in earlier Pacific battles. A landscape where entire sections of the island's terrain were physically reshaped by the sheer volume of ordnance expended over the battle's roughly 3-month duration. Many Okinawan civilians, particularly in the island's more rural and southern regions where the battle's final and most intense fighting eventually concentrated, had already been living under wartime conditions of food shortage and disruption for months before the American landing itself. A period of accumulating hardship that left much of the civilian population in a physically weakened and psychologically strained condition even before the direct combat phase of the battle began. A circumstance that historians studying the civilian experience have identified as one of several compounding factors that made the population especially vulnerable to the fear and desperation that shaped so many of the decisions made once the fighting actually reached their communities. Within this landscape, a documented and deeply tragic pattern emerged that historians examining the battle have spent decades since trying to fully understand and accurately characterize. In numerous locations across the island, particularly in the smaller Kerama Islands, where American forces landed before the main assault on Okinawa itself began, Japanese military personnel distributed grenades to civilian populations, and, in a substantial number of documented cases, directly encouraged or coerced groups of civilians into taking their own lives and the lives of family members, rather than risk capture. Acts that came to be known in Japanese historical terminology as compulsory group suicide. Tokashiki Island specifically, among the Kerama group, became the site of one of the most extensively documented and, in post-war Japanese historical and legal discourse, most frequently referenced individual incidents of this pattern. A case that has been examined in considerable detail by historians, and that has featured prominently in the broader textbook and public memory debates discussed later in this account, precisely because the surviving documentary and testimonial evidence from this specific location has allowed researchers to reconstruct the sequence of events with more clarity than is available for many other affected locations across the island. The Kerama Islands, a small group of islands off Okinawa's western coast, where American forces landed several days before the main assault on Okinawa itself began, became the site of some of the earliest and most extensively documented instances of these civilian deaths, largely because the concentrated, smaller geographic scale of the islands meant Japanese military personnel and civilian populations were often sheltering in close proximity within the same limited cave systems. A physical closeness that historians have identified as a significant factor in how directly and immediately Japanese military coercion or influence could shape civilian decision-making in these specific locations, compared to the larger, more geographically dispersed main island of Okinawa itself. Stop and consider what this actually meant for the ordinary Okinawan families caught in these circumstances, because the abstract historical terminology understates the specific, devastating human reality involved. Families who had been told for months, by their own government and military, that capture meant torture and violation, found themselves in caves and shelters, under direct military instruction or pressure to end their own lives rather than surrender. Decisions made under conditions of extreme fear, propaganda-driven belief, and, in many documented cases, direct coercion or the threat of violence from Japanese military personnel present in the same shelters. Post-war Japanese and Okinawan historical researchers, conducting extensive interviews with surviving family members and community witnesses across many decades following the war, have worked carefully to reconstruct the specific circumstances of individual incidents, case by case. Since the degree of direct military coercion versus civilian agency varied considerably from location to location and even from family to family, within the same general area, a methodological carefulness that reflects both genuine historical rigor and the profound sensitivity of documenting a subject that continues to affect the descendants and communities connected to those who died. Historians studying this specific phenomenon have identified significant variation in how directly Japanese military authority compelled these deaths, versus how much resulted from civilians acting on genuine, if propaganda-induced, belief that no other option remained available to them. A distinction that matters enormously for historical accuracy, but that does not diminish the scale of the resulting tragedy in either case. Beyond the Himeyuri Student Corps specifically, Japanese military authorities across Okinawa mobilized a considerably broader range of the civilian population into direct or indirect support roles during the battle, including younger male students organized into units that performed combat support and, in a documented number of cases, direct combat roles despite their age, a mobilization pattern that reflected the increasingly desperate manpower situation Japanese forces faced by this stage of the war, and that placed civilians, including minors, in direct physical danger, well beyond what a conventional understanding of civilian non-combatant status would ordinarily suggest. The Himeyuri Student Corps represents one of the most extensively documented and publicly remembered dimensions of the civilian experience during the battle. A group of Okinawan schoolgirls and their teachers, mobilized by Japanese military authorities to serve as nurses' aides in military field hospitals established inside caves across the island. These young women, most still in their teenage years, worked under horrific conditions, treating wounded Japanese soldiers as the battle's final weeks brought American forces steadily closer to their positions, and a substantial number of them died in the battle's final stages, some killed directly by bombardment, others through the same pattern of coerced or propaganda-driven suicide that affected the broader civilian population, and still others in circumstances that remain debated and incompletely documented, even today. American military planners had, in fact, anticipated the likelihood of encountering a large civilian population directly caught up in the fighting, and had made specific preparations to establish camps and provisioning systems for displaced and surrendering civilians ahead of the invasion itself. An operational planning effort that reflected lessons learned from earlier Pacific Island campaigns, where American forces had also encountered significant civilian populations, though never at the scale or under the specific propaganda-driven conditions that would characterize the Okinawa civilian experience specifically. What makes this specific chapter of the Battle of Okinawa so historically significant, beyond the sheer scale of civilian death involved, is the documented gap between the fate Japanese propaganda had taught civilians to expect from American capture and what actually happened to the Okinawan civilians who did, in fact, come into American custody as the battle progressed. American forces, encountering surrendering or captured Okinawan civilians in growing numbers as the campaign continued, generally provided food, medical treatment, and eventual relocation to civilian camps established specifically to manage the humanitarian situation the battle had created. Treatment that stood in direct and, for surviving civilians, often initially difficult to believe contrast to the violence and violation Japanese propaganda had assured them awaited any Okinawan who fell into American hands. This is not to suggest the American occupation and subsequent handling of Okinawan civilians was without its own genuine hardships and complications, since displaced civilians in American-run camps faced real difficulties, including overcrowding, disease, and the ordinary deprivations of a population suddenly uprooted from their homes and communities in the middle of an active war zone. Hardships that, while categorically different from the violence Japanese propaganda had specifically predicted, nonetheless represented a genuinely difficult and disorienting experience for civilians who had already endured months of escalating danger before ever reaching the relative safety of American custody. As word of this treatment spread among the remaining civilian population, still caught in the battle's later stages, increasing numbers of Okinawans began surrendering to American forces, rather than continuing to hide in caves and shelters under conditions of extreme danger, and, in many locations, continuing pressure from Japanese military personnel to avoid capture at any cost. A shift that historians studying the battle's final weeks have documented as a significant and telling reversal of the earlier pattern, civilians increasingly choosing survival through surrender once they had direct or second-hand evidence that the propaganda shaping their earlier fear-driven decisions had been false. Individual American soldiers and Marines who directly encountered surrendering Okinawan civilians during the battle's final weeks left their own first-hand accounts of these encounters, several describing the specific difficulty of persuading terrified civilians, some still armed with grenades they had been given for exactly the purpose the propaganda had intended, to lay down these weapons and trust that surrender genuinely meant safety rather than the violence they had been taught to expect. Encounters that several veterans later described as among the most emotionally difficult moments of their entire wartime service, communicating across language and trust barriers with people whose deepest fears about what capture meant had been deliberately and thoroughly instilled by their own government. By the time organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa finally collapsed in late June of 1945, the civilian death toll from the battle had reached a scale that most historical estimates place well into the tens of thousands, with some assessments suggesting the total civilian toll, when combined deaths from combat, disease, starvation, and the documented pattern of coerced or propaganda-driven suicide are considered together, may have approached or exceeded a significant proportion of the island's entire pre-war civilian population, a human cost that, relative to the size of the population involved, ranks among the most severe civilian tolls of any single battle fought anywhere during the entire Second World War. The specific difficulty historians face in establishing precise civilian casualty figures for the Battle of Okinawa reflects the sheer chaos and disruption of wartime record-keeping under these conditions, since pre-war census and population records were themselves disrupted by the fighting, and the specific circumstances of many individual civilian deaths, whether from direct combat, disease, starvation, or the coerced and propaganda-driven suicides discussed throughout this account, were often never formally documented at the time they occurred, leaving post-war researchers to reconstruct the overall scale of civilian loss through a painstaking combination of surviving records, family testimony, and comparative population analysis conducted across many subsequent decades. The battle's overwhelming combined firepower, the scale of civilian death, and the specific tragedy of the coerced and propaganda-driven suicides collectively earned Okinawa its lasting historical designation as the Typhoon of Steel, a name that Okinawan civilian survivors themselves, in post-war accounts and testimony, have generally endorsed as an accurate description of what living through those 3 months actually felt like. A battle whose intensity and human cost distinguished it even within a war already defined by battles of extraordinary destruction. The kamikaze campaign discussed in earlier coverage on this channel reached its largest single concentration of attacks during the Battle of Okinawa specifically, and the American proximity fuse technology examined in a separate video on this channel, proved decisive in the naval defense against those attacks, meaning the civilian suffering documented in this account unfolded against the backdrop of one of the most technologically and tactically consequential naval air battles of the entire Pacific War, occurring simultaneously in the waters surrounding the island, two dimensions of the same battle, the naval air campaign and the civilian ground experience, that together made Okinawa one of the most thoroughly documented and studied engagements of the entire conflict. In the decades following the war, Okinawa's specific civilian experience during the battle became the subject of ongoing and, at times, genuinely contentious historical and political debate within Japan itself, particularly regarding how thoroughly Japanese school textbooks and official historical accounts acknowledged the documented role Japanese military personnel played in directly encouraging or coercing civilian mass suicides. A debate that has continued into recent decades as Japanese historians, Okinawan survivor advocacy groups, and national education authorities have periodically clashed over exactly how this history should be taught to subsequent generations. These educational and historical debates within Japan have, at various points, involved formal disputes between survivor advocacy groups and national textbook approval authorities over specific wording used to describe the military's role in the civilian deaths. Disputes that reached the level of legal challenges and public protest on Okinawa itself, reflecting how directly this specific historical question continues to intersect with contemporary Okinawan political identity and the island's broader, still evolving relationship with the Japanese national government, more than 7 decades after the battle itself concluded. Okinawan survivors and their descendants have, through organizations dedicated to preserving this history, including memorial sites like the Himeyuri Peace Museum, established specifically to honor the student nurses who died during the battle, worked to ensure the civilian experience of the battle receives historical attention proportionate to its actual human cost, a recognition that, for much of the post-war period, remained overshadowed by the more conventionally documented military history of the battle itself. For many Okinawan families, the post-war decades brought a further complicated dimension to processing this history, since some survivors and their descendants have described a persistent reluctance within their own communities to discuss these events openly for many years after the war, a silence rooted in the personal and communal grief involved, in the complicated question of individual and family responsibility that the coerced nature of many of these deaths raises, and in a broader cultural hesitancy to revisit trauma of this magnitude even among the very communities most directly affected by it. A silence that began to lift only gradually as oral history projects and survivor advocacy organizations worked, often against considerable resistance, to create space for these stories to be documented before the last direct survivors and witnesses were gone. The post-war status of Okinawa added its own additional and lasting layer of complexity to how the island's wartime civilian experience has been remembered and processed in the decades since. Okinawa remained under direct American military administration for nearly 3 decades after the war's end, reverting to full Japanese sovereignty only in 1972, a prolonged period of separate administrative status that reflected the island's strategic military value to the United States in the post-war and early Cold War period, and that many Okinawans have continued to view, alongside the substantial American military presence that remains on the island to this day, through the lens of the civilian suffering their families and communities endured during the battle that first established Okinawa's outsized strategic significance to American Pacific military planning. Remember the question this story opened with: how does a civilian population suffer losses exceeding the military casualties of the battle fought around them? And why did so many of those deaths come from decisions civilians believed were their only option? The honest and difficult answer, established through decades of careful historical research, is that a fear campaign built and sustained over months by Japan's own military authorities, combined with direct coercion in a significant number of documented cases, convinced ordinary families that death was preferable to a captivity that, when it actually arrived for those who survived long enough to experience it, proved nothing like what they had been told to expect. That gap between manufactured fear and lived reality is the specific and enduring tragedy at the heart of the Battle of Okinawa's civilian story. If you want to understand what actually happened to the Okinawan civilians, caught between two advancing armies during the deadliest battle of the entire Pacific War, and how the fear campaign that shaped so many of their decisions compared to the reality that eventually unfolded, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.